Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating shift happening right now in how researchers and institutions are tackling racial equity. We're looking at this major transition from individual emotion, specifically white guilt, over to concrete structural change. So let's jump right in and look at the frameworks mapping out exactly how we move from personal feelings to massive systemic reform. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start at the micro level with the limits of white guilt, then move into reforming institutional education and corporate accountability indexes. After that, we'll scale up to rethinking consumer anti-racism, look at the macro reparations model, and finish up with building authentic structural compassion.
Okay, so to understand this structural shift, we've got to establish the emotional baseline first. Section 1, the limits of white guilt.
In sociological literature, white guilt is actually viewed as a recognized and often necessary first step. It's kind of like a bridge going from total racial obliviousness over to structural awareness. But, and this is a big but, it has a major limitation. It's highly volatile and intensely self-focused. Because guilt is primarily motivated by relieving our own internal psychological discomfort, it often stops at what researchers call performative allyship. Like just posting a hashtag on social media. And that leaves the actual, real-world foundations of racial hierarchies completely untouched.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how researchers actually map this out using path analysis. Step 1 is the cognitive part, recognizing unearned privilege. But simply recognizing privilege doesn't automatically equal support for policy change. It actually has to pass through Step 2, the emotional mediator of white guilt, to successfully mobilize Step 3, which is actual support for compensatory social policies. It's a very specific psychological chain reaction. However, empirical data shows this model has a strict ceiling. White guilt robustly predicts support for compensatory policies. Think things like targeted funding, but it completely fails to predict support for policies that increase overall structural access, like totally changing how a company hires. So quantitative social psychologists note that guilt, well, it really only gets us part of the way toward systemic equity. Let's see how this plays out at the organizational level. Section 2, Reforming Institutional Education. When we look at institutional training frameworks, the literature points out a pretty stark contrast. Highly individualistic privilege-checking exercises, well, they often backfire. They tend to encourage defensive withdrawal or just result in purely performative confessions. To counter this, scholars are advocating for something called complicity pedagogy. Instead of focusing on your own individual absolution, complicity pedagogy shifts the focus entirely onto our collective responsibility for how institutions are actually designed and run. This whole approach is heavily grounded in Iris Marion Young's social connection model of responsibility. Basically, this model argues that all individuals are positioned within racialized hierarchies, literally regardless of their personal intentions. You're a part of the machine, even if you really don't want to be. Because of that, taking action under this model prioritizes auditing the system itself, rather than trying to prove you are subjectively a good person. Shifting gears now to the corporate sphere. Section 3, Corporate Accountability Indexes. Let's look at how companies are being advised to move beyond just PR gestures. According to the sources, there's a strong demand to put a halt to non-performative, symbolic statements. Researchers view these merely as speech acts that companies use to substitute for actual material change. Instead, the literature outlines that these corporate PR commitments need to be replaced by diversity accountability indexes. This means every single public declaration a company makes must be legally bound to transparent, easily quantifiable metrics. So what exactly does a legally bound index look like in practice? Well, scholars outline 3 main features. First, direct capital allocation percentages for minoritized contractors. Second, binding timelines for actually diversifying executives and corporate boards. And third, rigorous, independent annual audits that are backed by automatic financial penalties if the company doesn't comply. The whole point here is enforcing binding structural change over just making nice public declarations. Expanding our lens outward a bit now. Section 4, Rethinking Consumer Anti-Racism. We're looking at how individuals spend their money and share resources in their own neighborhoods. Empirical consumer research reveals a super fascinating dynamic going on here. On one side, you have what's called micro-reparative consumerism. This is, for example, choosing to buy a Black-owned product or maybe using a slightly more expensive service provider simply because of its racial label. Now, studies show these low-cost purchases give the buyer a psychological transaction of racial absolution. They make us feel better about ourselves morally, for sure, but they fail to actually challenge systemic wealth concentration. So the alternative framework presented by scholars is the necessity of accepting material loss. So the crucial point is that actionable structural policy requires dominant groups to accept actual material loss in areas they've traditionally protected. This means things like zoning reforms to introduce affordable housing right into wealthy neighborhoods. It means school district desegregation, even when it directly affects the competitive advantage of dominant group children. And it includes progressive tax reforms for historically redlined communities. The research argues that without this actual material shift, real structural equity is just going to remain completely out of reach. Moving all the way up to the highest macro level now. Section 5, the Macro Reparations Model. Here we're exploring the academic arguments for national historical structural compensation. 15. That is the number of generations that racial oppression has endured in the United States. We're talking from slavery through legal segregation right up to contemporary racism. Because of this massive, sprawling timeline, scholars argue that any meaningful reparations model absolutely must be a multi-generational commitment. And because of that massive multi-generational scope, the proposed macro reparations model is honestly staggering in scale. The literature highlights that the federal financial commitment must ultimately reach into the trillions of dollars. To put that into perspective, scholars argue this commitment needs to be on par with the U.S. national defense budget just to actually compensate for these historical and structural injustices. But how exactly does that money get spent? Well, the literature heavily favors a collective policy focus over giving out individual per capita payouts. The goal here is community restoration. We're talking direct funding for large-scale job training, expansive education and housing programs, and massive seed capital for Black-owned businesses. It also pairs this with non-monetary legislative reforms, like aggressively guaranteeing voting rights, along with widespread public education on American racial history. All right, for our final section, we're bringing this trillion-dollar narrative back down to the human level. Section 6, building authentic structural compassion. How do we authentically participate in these massive systemic shifts? Psychological interventions are absolutely critical here to avoid paternalistic white saviorism, which is basically when individuals engage in charity just to resolve their own personal guilt. To build authentic compassion, we have to shift our focus away from looking for individual bad actors and look towards systemic factors. This helps reduce what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. That's a psychological bias where we blame minoritized individuals for their own circumstances rather than recognizing the massive, broader systems that are actually at play. Furthermore, the sources make it explicitly clear. Effective allyship must always center the design and the needs of the communities being supported. Minoritized communities must be the ones to define and evaluate these strategies, period. Additionally, the emotional labor that historically gets placed on these communities to educate their allies, that has to be minimized. The burden of education squarely belongs on the institutions and the allies themselves. We've scaled all the way from the internal feelings of white guilt straight up to trillion-dollar macro reparations, and the tension is pretty clear. So I want to leave you with this final, thought-provoking question directly from the research. How can society bridge the gap between seeking individual psychological comfort and making the profound material commitments required for true structural change? It is a massive challenge, but as this explainer has shown, the sociological blueprints for that change are already drawn. Thanks so much for joining me to explore this vital topic today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.